everybody. Welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Richard Rosenow. He received his M.B.A. from Vanderbilt University and currently works at One Model as a VP of People Analytics Strategy. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. I heard the emphasis on M.B.A. there. It's a scary term sometimes to IO, but no, thank you. Very, very thrilled to be here.
No, it's a great. It's actually a good point. We're hoping to have a upcoming episode to talk about the differences between like a master's in IO or an MBA. It's definitely an interesting topic. But before we get in, we wanted to announce that Richard is actually our 52 or 52nd episode, our year anniversary. So thank you for joining us on this recording. We're excited
Thank you.
I am honored and thrilled to be here, and congratulations to the both of you. I mean, yeah, 52 episodes in 52 weeks. Is that what it was?
Yep.
Yeah, wow,
Incredible.
Really. Now that you say
incredible.
it.
That's a feat. That's a feat. So yeah, congratulations to both of you.
I didn't even realize.
No, it's been a great journey so far. We've met some amazing people, heard some amazing experiences, and hopefully we helped a person or two along the way. I like to think we did.
Sure,
But we're very excited to get to talk to you today about your journey in people analytics. I know it's a growing field, especially in the IO space, and we know you've done some fascinating things in it so far. Both Brandon and I are very big fans of your just social media LinkedIn page. We were talking about before you hopped on the paternity leave part of like your experiences.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, that gets a surprising amount of attention, but it's one of those things that like a lot of times men just don't talk about it. So I tried to put a little something in there, and that it sparked a lot of good conversations with people over the years.
Yeah, and for our listeners that haven't seen it yet, on Richard's page, it says paternity leave and it says it's an apprenticeship.
Yes.
It's
unpaid.
Brilliant.
Unpaid apprenticeship.
It's absolutely brilliant.
I'll have to steal that, in the later years.
There you go.
But yeah, so to get to the main point of our podcast, you are very big at the people analytics space. You have some amazing job experience, but you also do blogs and you do speaking. And I wanted to first ask you, where did this interest come about? Because I know it looked like you started your job experience in HR and then you kind of transitioned to people analytics, which are sometimes one and the same, but then I know in some companies it's a totally different thing. So can you just talk a little bit about like where your love for people analytics came from?
Oh, totally. Totally. Yeah, no, it's a fun one. I think going way back, I was sociology undergrad. So I kind of wanted to understand like how and why do people come together? Why do communities form? And really from that like quantitative side. And for the longest time, I thought that's where I was going. I was like, I'm going to go for a PhD. This is it. I'm going to be an academic. I love it. And then in my senior year, I took like 3 credits just to get an internship. So I didn't have to take another class for a nonprofit internship. And I realized I was like, oh, I can apply a lot of this stuff. And I can go in and I can build programs and I can see communities come together and I can work in these different ways. So actually, I kicked off my career in nonprofit. I worked in for the YMCA Pittsburgh, Chicago, YMCA USA for about 5 years, and got to do a lot of different things. I think that's the benefit of working in a nonprofit is you can raise your hand and just about do anything within if you're excited, motivated, and trustworthy with your work. But I got to do some financial analysis and I got to do some small data analysis within the HR teams, and I started to do some modeling. I was like, hey, like I really like this stuff. Like, how can I find a way to marry this up, this data interest that I have, along with this, like, I'd love to learn more about sociology and these different kind of social sciences. And someday I'd like to get paid to do those things. And so a little bit of that transition out of the space was from that. And I think at the time, if I would have had a mentor who knew about IO psychology, maybe a little bit more about different social sciences, I very well could have ended up on a different path. I had some phenomenal mentors that had gone back for an MBA. And really the allure there was like, I want to learn how private corporations are doing things. And I want to learn from the very best about that. And maybe someday I want to bring that back to nonprofit too. And so I went to the MBA to make like a kind of flag, a little bit of a switch, because it's hard to go straight from nonprofit to a new field. And I knew I wanted to get into HR. So really focused in the HR space, made the jump over, and had a year where I was a HR VP. And really, I didn't think I was going to be. And I did not want to be an HR VP. I was in a rotational program that the second year, they're like, you could do people analytics in year 2. You have to be an HR VP for year 1. And I was like, fine, I'll do it. And it was life-changing, like truly a experience of getting that sort of like in the trenches, had a population I worked for, had an executive I supported, strategic HR, and it's totally shaped how I've looked at people analytics in this space. So I'm getting a little long here, but I quickly from there found my love for people analytics and got to be part of some phenomenal teams across the space. Saw Facebook go from 15 to 150 people in people analytics. Got to roll out some platforms across Uber. Saw Nike, which was an incredible story to itself, kind of grow a team from scratch, kind of plateau, and some explosions happened around that team. And then got to run my own team at Argo AI. So a little bit of kind of all over the place, but it really prepared me for this role I'm in now over at One Model, where I get to talk to a lot of people analytics teams around the world now. So that's me in a nutshell, and happy to go deeper on any part of that.
That's amazing that you were kind of able to give us that overview. I was going to highlight some of the companies you work for, so thanks for doing my job for me there, Richard.
There you go.
You know, in the experience that you have, and just kind of tying in kind of the early career experience, would you kind of say that you found yourself doing that what we call an IO like job crafting, where you were creating a role for yourself that aligned with the things that interested you and the things that you were skilled at to try and forge this career into people analytics? Is that kind of what you saw?
Oh, totally. Yeah, and I think especially in my time at nonprofit, I did a lot of job crafting. It was a lot of kind of like, well, I kind of like this. Maybe I'll start doing that. And like for a minute, when I was in the nonprofit, I was actually a GIS analyst. I did geographic maps of the city of Chicago and showed where poverty was and how our programs fit into that. And I got really good at GIS for a minute, and kind of realized that's not where I wanted to be. So kind of had to backpedal a little on that too. But yeah, I think that idea of when you're a student and you're looking out at the job market, it can look like, what am I going to sign myself up for? Do I want to do these 15 things on this job description? And it can be pretty daunting. But the reality is, as soon as you get in the door, that job description's outdated.
Mhm.
The reality of the work changes, the company changes, things shift underneath you, and people start to recognize your strengths and they pull you different directions. So it's very much so a fluid thing. It's not a kind of static, this is my job, this is it. Maybe it used to be that, maybe 50, 60 years ago, but it's not that today. So yeah, I think it's been nonstop job crafting ever since. And this role I'm in today, I could not have gotten into this role without some crafting and building and kind of figuring that out too. And I never would have expected my career to look like this. So I think, yeah, to summarize, it's very hard when you're a student to see down the path that far. But just know, once you get into the company, if there's people you care about, if there's work you care about, if you're in the right spot, you can kind of build and shape and tweak things along the way.
I like that point because it can be like daunting to sometimes look at these descriptions. You're like, oh god, like this is going to be tough, especially when you come out of like any sort of graduate program or just even undergraduate program, because you think you know stuff and you do know stuff, but then you're like, oh, this is very different. Like I know we've had some guests come on where like the things that you do in grad school or the projects that you do, and then you go into the real world and you're like, oh, like doing this costs money. I can't just come up with like 20 different items for like a test. Did you find a struggle in that, like coming out from your graduate programs and being like, oh, like I can't really do the exact same sort of things?
Yeah, I'll say one of the big perks of an MBA over an IO is that the MBA program is pretty realistic about some of the job market pieces, and they prepare you a little differently. So it actually does weaponize you a little bit for going into the job market. Like you learn your elevator pitch, you get your resume up to speed. They're very good at some of those things that are around placement. But I'll say one of the best pieces of advice I got was that first job you get out of your graduate program, it's not going to be your forever job. It just took some of the wind and some of the potential out of that in a positive way. That it was like, because everyone's killing themselves during recruitment season, they're trying to go find roles, they're bickering over things, they're working through stuff. But like most of my class immediately changed to different jobs once they got out there. And so I think it's very common. And from an MBA perspective, they tend to see a little bit more of the stats about where people go and how people change their careers. And they were able to share that with us pretty early. It's like, you're not going to stay in that job, and that's okay. You're going to figure out what you love, you're going to learn what you hate, you're going to figure out what you missed. And then that next job after your MBA, like go try to stick at that one for a little while and try to fit things a little bit longer. But I think they did prepare us well to know that that first one was, you could be very lucky and you could be in that job forever. But the reality was, you're probably going to miss.
We're getting a precursor to our next episode that we
Yes.
where we discuss the differences. But I like that point too, and I feel like when it comes to the people analytics space, going back to the work you do, Richard, um, it is a very interesting field because it's growing so fast. Like you saw all these teams grow at all these different organizations that you were at. Something that I wonder, as somebody who's in a role watching these teams grow, was there also a lot of learning on the job that you had to do in those organizations because their teams were getting to such a massive size that the practices that you were probably using became maybe a little more outdated?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I would say that one of the interesting things about people analytics is we're seeing this function come together. Like if we think about like payroll or compensation or recruiting, like we've been doing those for 100 years. That's some of the earliest things that a function that an HR group has done. And to see the practice of people analytics, like the use of data to make good decision making, that's been going on for a very long time. But the functional alignment of, okay, you're in a center of excellence, you're supporting people with analytics, you're supporting people across HR, that's got maybe 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 if I update my numbers. But it's like, that's not a long time in the grand scheme of things here. So we're seeing this function still figure itself out. So reorgs or movements, and especially in some of those early teams where they started to hit scale, you start to kind of collapse in on yourself unless you build some operational rigor in there too. And so I think for these early teams, there's not been a path set. I'll even say some of those early teams have had massive changes in the past couple of years that whatever path they were building might not be the path that the current teams can even try to recreate. And so there's still a lot of this, like, let's figure it out, let's build this together, let's figure out how to function as a people analytics unit, I think across everyone in the Fortune 500. I mean, nobody has like a playbook they're playing from that they know how to win. We're all trying different things, we're tweaking things, we're building things. And that's a joy to me. And I have a ton of fun with that. I think if that scares you, maybe like accounting, go to accounting, it's very stable, they have rules, they have central governing bodies, but like this like naturally occurring decentralized movement of people analytics functions coming together, that's really delighted me as just a student of the space.
I like the point that you brought up about like compensation recruiting, and like those practices have been done for so long. People know what they're doing. When it comes to people analytics, if you say you're doing like a project or you have something going on and you present it to an executive board or leadership, have you ever come across the struggle of like getting them to accept this new practice or accept like what you're trying to do? Because I could see possibly that they're like, oh, this is like a new thing. We don't really agree. And it's like, they've only been doing this for a couple of years. Let's just like forget about
All the time. Yeah, and
it.
I think that's the like you can lead a horse to water kind of moment. And I think a lot of new grads I've worked with have that recognition within the first couple of months. But like, hey, I did this massive study. I looked at these different meta-analysis. Maybe I've done a lit review. I figured out these things, and like they try to pitch it. Then, and the business is like, no, I have to do something else. And over time, I think people start to figure out like, hey, there's more to this than just a right decision. There's a good enough decision sometimes, or maybe I have to make a bad decision now because I have different constraints that are going on around me. And there's a lot of nuance to just like the day-to-day battle of work that sometimes the academically rigorous or the correct answer to a problem isn't able to be run at that time. Whether again, resource constraints, politics, different things that are going on, it's a very complex system. And I think starting to thread into that complex system, there's an early moment in a lot of researchers' careers where they kind of the gears kind of grind just a minute, but then when they start seeing like, okay, I can make change though, and I can influence lives and I can support people, and there's other ways to get value out of your job than just kind of releasing something that's correct. And then you start to kind of like shave some things that, hey, if I would have done this in grad school, maybe I would have gotten a C plus. But that's what the business needs to actually move forward and make slightly better decisions. That might be what works now. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that, but it's that difference between like correctness and business value, which is a little hard to grasp, but then you pick it up as you go.
Yeah, it's an interesting point too, because correctness can look different at different organizations. So when you're trying to
Yeah.
make those changes in a company, especially if you're transitioning to a different job, then you have to try and adapt to the new circumstances. Richard, one question that I'm wondering about, like when we go over and we looked at your LinkedIn and we talked about the little joke we saw about there with the paternity leave, but one thing we also saw was the project management certification.
Hmm.
And as somebody who does a lot of project management, I just wanted to know like what value did that bring to you in your career, and like if you could also speak to kind of how you utilize it in a daily basis at your work.
Yeah, definitely. You dug deep in my profile. I dropped that from my. I had a bunch of like the letters after my name for a while, but I ended up dropping those. I was like, ah. But so project management professional. So for a minute when I was at the YMCA, my job title was PMO, project manager, PMP, which meant I was the project management office project manager, project management professional, which was my favorite title I've ever had. Just the sheer amount of project that I got to work on. No, I think so. I did a certification at the University of Chicago when I was out there, and it was eye opening to the sense that I was like, oh my God, there's a standard way to do projects. How am I learning this after school? It's like this like thing that I should have known in like grade school stuff where there's like standard terminology. And if you start using the same words, suddenly you can start using the same frameworks and you can start thinking about things in different ways. But just that sense of like there's ways to do projects that make them easier was knowledge that was new to me at the time. So that by itself was just incredibly helpful. I'll say it opened some doors early in my career, absolutely. When it came to like being able to speak to the work I was doing and really a through line of my career within people analytics. I'm not a researcher and I'm not a data scientist. I am a little bit more of an operations and project management person within that space. So I found my career kind of building and supporting in different ways to kind of navigate the flow of work. And we see that when teams start to get a little bit bigger. The natural inclination at first for people analytics is to hire a lot of doers because you need to. You need to hire people that can do the work and scale. But eventually you start to get to the point where you're like, hey, if I had one horizontal role, if I had one person that can just make all the projects a little bit easier, suddenly I can unlock a lot of value for everybody else. And that's a role that I've fit kind of throughout my career within the people analytics space. So yeah, it's absolutely been a cornerstone to my kind of background career way of thinking, and it's something I'm very grateful for.
I want to kind of piggyback off Brandon's question because I loved your response to that. Is there any other ways you kind of supplemented your information? Because we're definitely in an age, especially in the people analytics space, with like AI and new software is coming out and new ways to do analytics. They can't just fit all into one graduate degree. Are there like certain things that you do to keep up to date? Just like the new things out there.
Oh yeah, I think one of the best and underrated features on LinkedIn is the unfollow button. And I'll say that because like your LinkedIn should be serving you in the sense like when you log in and you've got your news feed of different things that are going on, it should be stuff that's relevant, interesting, and gives you some energy. If it doesn't, like make sure you get some of those people out of there. Because like when people start sharing some crazy stuff, oddball, I'll unfollow, I move them along. Because that LinkedIn feed has been critical to my learning. And I think that's really where this all started, kind of posting on LinkedIn, blogging, different things of that nature. Is it was very self-serving. I wanted to learn from the very best people in the space, and I wanted to track them down, follow them, start getting them into my feed. And building that feed has just been a cornerstone. So I think if you're looking at LinkedIn, you're like, well, why would I network, or like what is this social network for? If you start seeing it as an information delivery system, it's a really, really good platform to start to kind of feed your interests and feed your career in that way. I'd say the other one is I'll give a shout out just podcasts. I am all about podcasts. I listen at 2x speed. So if I'm talking very fast, I apologize. This is natural for a podcast. You have to talk fast. But no, I when I go on walks, when I'm doing things around the house, like I always try to go for podcasts because there's just a tremendous amount of people out there to learn from, to listen to hear from. And I'll give a third option. There's a fellow, Ben Weber. He was over at Humanize, founded the company, MIT, brilliant dude. But he posts his academic playlist every couple days where he goes for runs and listens to different talks from academics. I steal those every now and then too, and kind of listen to those and keep up to date where I can. But yeah, I think we're in a world where you've got to shape your content so that it feeds you. Otherwise, your content will just come at you, as we've seen with a lot of other platforms that are out there. So I try to keep myself to LinkedIn as best I can, and I read everything. Everything comes across. I read about people analytics in particular.
That's a great point too, because I kind of like the idea of crafting your LinkedIn to portray the message of information that you want to hear. And one thing that kind of leads to a question that Joe and I wanted to discuss with you is just as you're compiling all that information and seeing all the different professionals in the field who you're gaining so much knowledge from, what are some of the like recent common themes that you've maybe come across while you're like going through and sifting through all that information and posting to everybody so they can be just as informed as you are?
That's a good question. I think one of the funny things is a little bit of an aside, but I've with a lot of these like LLMs and training data and the way we've been seeing those, I started to realize like I'm not that far off from some of these LLMs in terms of just like ingesting a large amount of data and then like bringing it together and summarizing it. I'm like, oh, my job's starting to look a little too similar to some of those. But yeah, I think some of the themes. One of the interesting ones I'm seeing a lot about lately is developer productivity. There's a lot of people talking about software developer productivity, and I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is we're a little bit past this age where software developers had a free ride to kind of do things like kind of they were software development was king. You couldn't find them; they were hard to get. They were bringing them in. I think this like chat GPT tech revolution we're seeing with like some of these things that can augment software engineers a lot of questions getting asked now about like, hey, are our developers productive? Who are our best ones? Who are the worst ones? And it gets back to a lot of these core things in psychology about like, what does performance mean? And what does it mean to be productive? And these like really core issues about kind of social science and trying to measure work. But that's when I've seen a lot of people talking about that lately. And that excites me about the field. Because I think it's bringing in new technologies and different ways of looking at things and some understanding that's not just like lines of code, but maybe it's how are they spending their time? Are they happy? Are they engaged? And there's a lot of really good conversation happening in that front. If I were to think about some other themes, man, return to office is a fascinating one. I think that's fascinating and disappointing and exciting. There's all kinds of different emotions around that. I've been fully remote since 2016, so across a lot of different jobs, and that's been a cornerstone to my career and just my work life balance. So I'm very much in favor of companies when they can go remote, they should to tap the best talent, to find the best talent, support people the way they want to be supported. But I'm seeing a lot of people analytics teams still working through that, and that was an interesting one because on the way out the door during COVID, everybody realized we didn't know how to measure people when they were working remote, and we saw a lot of investment. And now everybody coming back, we're still struggling with that problem. So I think a lot of companies are thinking about like how are we making good decisions? How are we supporting people? Some interesting things happening there. Those are kind of two top of mind ones.
No, they're great, and I really like your point about the software engineers and developers, and like with the way that work is being done now. We actually just had a speaker, Rick Polak, and he was talking about like Copilot, and the way code is being written and like the productivity. And they were talking a little bit about like Outlook and measuring productivity. And you're right, it really is crazy the way that like the kind of the information that they have now and the type of work that people are going to be doing because of ChatGPT, or things like Copilot, and like how fast things can get done now that they weren't able to get done before. Um, that was a little bit of ramble, but the point that I'm trying to make is it really is different now than it used to be. And I also want to ask you more about the work from home or work in office. I know you said that being remote, like you would, it kind of encourage. Do you see any point where companies should have like a hybrid office, or you really think like remote's kind of the way to go?
I think what we've seen is that choice matters, and having the ability to choose where you work matters to some people and frankly a lot of people. I think the difficulty I'm trying to wrap my head around, because I did a lot of work in location strategy earlier in my career, where like where talent was, kind of that talent intelligence space, and trying to understand pockets of talent. Where should we be building offices? And coming out of that work and seeing this remote option, I think especially for people analytics teams, I get frustrated when I see people analytics teams that are fully on site because as a field, our talent is so scattered, and I don't think there's a city, maybe outside of New York City, that has enough centralized talent that you could really build a team fully on site for people analytics. And we're a function that largely supports people who support people. So we're a little bit back office in that sense. We can do our job in a lot of different places, and we frankly need a lot of alone time too. So I think I get frustrated when I see kind of like across the board policies, whether they're across the board remote, across the board hybrid, across the board in person. It's just the nuance gets lost, and it's some of that's because you just have to make a decision at the end of the day. You can't make personalized decisions for every person, but it feels like the technology is getting close to the point where we could start to make those personalized decisions and some different ways to support people. So there's some missed opportunities when people are saying back to office, it's how we've always done it, and just the lost knowledge that we picked up over these past couple of years of seeing how we did it. I'd like to see that applied a little bit more.
I like that point too, because just because it was how we always did it doesn't mean that it's always the right way to go. And in the typical IO psychology world, it depends. So it could work for some teams and not for other teams, but for specifically in the people analytics space, it makes sense that that doesn't necessarily need to always be in person, because when you are providing support for people, like you people could also be anywhere, especially in like the way that the global economy is now. One thing that I was wondering too, Richard, with your experience, like you're talking about strategizing where to build companies based off of talent. I wanted to pull at that point just for a second because I never really heard about that. Like I never really thought about it until you said it, and it like made sense. So when you were kind of doing work in that area, like what kind of work was that, and like how did you even like how'd you compile data on that?
Yeah. Oh, I'd be happy to talk about it. So there's a discipline called talent intelligence, which is a little bit different, but kind of similar to people analytics. And there's some blurred lines between the two, and like neither one is really perfectly named. But what happens in talent intelligence? It says like, okay, let me look out at this external labor market data. What can I find out about that? What can I bring back to support decision making to make good decisions? Because I think very early in my career, I was working for a company that needed to move, and the CEO had a house somewhere, and they decided to move there. And it's like that wasn't a good decision. There's better ways to do this. And I think like the kind of first step a lot of people do is like census data or government data. And then what we're seeing is there's a whole field of technology out there that summarizes and collates all of the job postings. And then you start to see, okay, they actually have all the social profiles. So all the LinkedIn profiles, maybe all the resumes that are on Career Builder or Monster, they all get vacuumed up too. And so there's a really interesting data set out there about what companies are hiring for, what talent's out there, what the government understands. And it's that triangulation of those things. You can start to see things like, hey, the labor market in San Francisco might be declining over the past couple of years. Or maybe if we need silicon engineers, maybe Austin actually has the concentration and maybe we don't have an office there yet. And so it's a lot of that kind of like understanding what skills do we need? And then what skills do we have? Where's the gap? And then if I need to fill that gap, what's the best place I can do that? So it's still a relatively nascent field. I think a little bit later than people analytics in terms of coalescing, but it's got some phenomenal proponents out there. Toby Colshaw runs the Talent Intelligence Collective. They have their own WhatsApp group and Facebook group and a bunch of other places. And yeah, happy to talk more about that anytime. But it's a definitely an interesting part of the people analytics journey that I started this space thinking I was going to do more HR data, internal data. Ended up doing kind of a tour through kind of external data. Got to do some other things in that space. And so there's a lot of opportunity out there to touch a lot of different areas.
That's really cool. I had no idea that was like
So
possible.
cool.
Like I see Brandon smiling too. Like, yeah, that's like a cool data set that you have right there.
Yeah, it's funny. I imagine with IO psychology, it's a little bit more like person based, inside the company based, a little bit more. It's psychology, but that kind of like very macro, like almost like labor economics view. A lot of biopsychologists end up working with that data in different ways. And there's even some ways I've seen some companies start to blend that, where you see things like what is the attrition rate within a city, or what are the. I mean, diversity is a really good example. If you're trying to build a new location in Portland, you're going to have a very different, diverse background than if you try to build it in one of the more diverse cities across the US. So I think there's a lot of choices that companies can make that influence a lot of on the ground decisions later, but they're more of those kind of macro decisions.
It definitely makes sense. I'm glad you talked about it because now we know.
Right.
uh,
There
I
we go.
have one more question before we get to like our final overall. We talked a lot about analytics just in general during this recording about different data sets that we've used. How was your experience just learning people analytics or like HR analytics? Are there like certain skills that you found better than others when like having to work with data?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I learned. I'm getting old enough now that I learned it in a time that the resources were different a little bit too. So like during my MBA program, we didn't have a people analytics course, and it was just kind of like not. It was still forming as a function, but I took a lot of other courses, and like one of the best courses I took was marketing analytics. And I think there's a good lesson there where marketing has tread a lot of these things that we're trying to do in people analytics before. So they've got conversion funnels, we've got recruitment funnels, they've got brand awareness, we've got kind of employee engagement. There's a lot of these different kind of parallels with the way that marketing operates. And the best early people analytics teams just stole those things directly. I took healthcare analytics, and that was a lot of like trying to understand how to staff nursing. But it was more kind of healthcare oriented. But I took that course to try to steal that stuff and bring it over to people analytics. And I think likewise, even financial data, like trying to understand and forecast and think about the data within that. There's a lot of good coursework out there in a lot of other disciplines that you kind of have to cobble and pull together. I will say though, there are some just phenomenal resources now, though. I mean, when it comes to learning R, there's an incredible resource by a fellow named Craig Starbuck. He's one of the head of people analytics over Roku. He's had a phenomenal career in people analytics. He wrote a full statistics textbook in R for HR data.
Wow.
It's an unreal resource. So you can learn end-to-end stats with using only HR examples the whole way through. And I don't know how he did it as like a side gig outside his job. He's a tremendous person. But like that kind of resource is life changing for someone who wants to get into people analytics now, where you don't have to go learn healthcare analytics. You can actually learn people analytics now. I'll say even like for people that are listening that might not be in a program yet, like NYU has a master's in people analytics. That's new and that's rare. But it's interesting to see those sorts of things pop up. And if you're a grad student at NYU doing IO Psych, go find those courses because they're phenomenal over there. So I think we're starting to see more and more kind of modern resources pop up. And I try to collect those and share those whenever I can. So I'll send you a few more for the notes in the after the podcast here.
Oh, we'll take it. We'll
No,
definitely take
yeah.
it.
That's awesome. That's super cool that NYU just had a people analytics program, and I just feel like that speaks volumes to the way that the field itself is growing. And as Joe kind of said, for our final question that we wanted to ask you, Richard, it's the same question we ask all of our guests. But you've given us so much valuable information just about the people analytics space and just how you've kind of grown your career around people analytics. We want to ask you, what kind of advice do you have for potential IO psychology early career people or people who are trying to start their journey in the people analytics world? What kind of advice do you have for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the advice I'd like to pass on is that the people in the workplace are as confused, if not more confused than you are. And I think that's especially true for people analytics. It's something I try to share a lot. So with my role at One Model, I get to talk to a lot of teams that are in kind of like early stages or different stages of people analytics. That's part of my job, to kind of go out in the field and chat with a lot of different people. And within that, I do a lot of conversations where I say like, hey, like imposter syndrome is real. You might feel like you're not doing enough because like a lot of times we hear about like the very best case study someone's ever done, or the example in our textbook is this like phenomenal example. And like most things fail out there, most things are hard, and it's tough. But I think when the function is new and the world is new and things are still shifting around you, everybody's a little confused. And so it's okay to be confused. It's just get out there, start picking up what you can, start learning what you can, and start to give back. And that process helps build things and helps kind of stabilize the world around you. And that's the least we can do. But I think going into it, if you're thinking people in the workplace know what they're doing, you'll be mistaken when you get there, and you'll feel very comfortable very soon once you're in the workplace.
It's great advice, and it kind of brings it back to your first point about looking at like job responsibilities and duties and being like, "Oh wow, that's that's tough." And then you get there and you're like, honestly don't really know exactly what I'm doing." But when
Yeah,
yeah, no, it's funny because it's also it could be the truth sometimes. But then you're right. If you kind of keep plugging away and you ask questions and you learn, you'll be able to do it. You know, you were able to go through school. You could do this. If there's people around you doing it, like
spot
you
on.
can learn from them. So yeah, I absolutely love that advice.
100%.
But thank you so much, Richard, for coming on. We definitely both learned a lot. I know our listeners will definitely learn a lot from what you had to say. And hopefully we get to see you soon. I know Brandon got to meet you at the last PSYOP, so hopefully I get to meet you in person as well.
Yeah, I'll be back at SIOP. I'm traveling a bunch with this job that I'm in. I get to kind of go out there and see people out in the field. But really, if people want to get connected, I'm on LinkedIn. Best place to find me, Richard Rosenow. We've got our onemodel.co/blog. You can see some things on there too that we share, kind of resources in the space. But really, reach out to your community, talk to people. People analytics people love to talk. If you didn't get that from this past 30 minutes that we've been chatting here, like people analytics people love this space. So don't worry about reaching out to people. And I hope to see you all at SIOP.
Yeah, we'll put all of that in the description too, so that way anyone, if they want to come and find all the great information and resources you have, they can do that and they can make sure that they're just as up to date as we are now on the people analytics space. But Richard, once again, thank you so much. We're looking forward to meeting you up with you again at PSYOP this year.
Yeah.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
That was another awesome episode we got there. 52. It's crazy we made it this far, but with Richard, that was just really fun. I feel like I learned so much and I could have kept going with him for another hour.
No, absolutely. If there's anyone to talk to people analytics about, it's definitely him. I mean, you can just see from his experience and just the knowledge that he shared with us this recording. Hopefully, we get to talk with him again.
Yeah, no, I know. We'll definitely make it a point to meet up with him at PSYOP. And for all of those early career IOs out there, he's definitely at PSYOP and he's always very warm and welcoming. I got to meet up with him there and it was very awesome. Like he treated me like he knew me and I only got to speak with him for a few seconds. So he's a very like warm and inviting person for those of you that want to learn more about people analytics.
No, absolutely. Make sure to reach out to him or connect with him if you're interested in this space. But thank you, everybody, for listening for 52 episodes, and we'll catch you next Friday.
We're glad you're not tired of us yet. Don't worry, we got more coming.